Ghostwire Tokyo is the latest game from Tango Gameworks, the Bethesda-owned studio behind the Evil Within games. And it's a game that's been on my radar since it was revealed at E3 with that awesome CGI trailer a few years back. Of course, we know Tango have a great pedigree as they were founded by video game royalty Shinji Mikami, one of the forefathers of the survival horror genre and the director of Resident Evil 1 and 4. The Evil Within games served as spiritual successors to Mikami's Resident Evil games and were both very good. But I still didn't really know what to expect out of Ghostwire Tokyo. Its blend of first-person action and horror is an unproven concept, and Ghostwire Tokyo is an open-world game, which is a huge departure from the linear Evil Within games. It's also no secret that Ghostwire Tokyo had a tortured development cycle, losing its creative director, Ikumi Nakamura, midway through development. But once again, Tango have proved that they're an incredibly talented studio, and despite its tumultuous development cycle, Ghostwire Tokyo has turned out great. In a medium that's so iterative, it's always great to encounter something that's genuinely new and fresh, and that's exactly what Ghostwire Tokyo is. Its exploration of Japanese folklore and blend of horror and spell-flinging action make Ghostwire Tokyo one of the PS5's most original and creative games. Ghostwire Tokyo takes place in a world where the vast majority of Tokyo's population have suddenly vanished after coming into contact with a mysterious mist. When we meet our protagonist Akito, he's seemingly on the verge of death after being involved in an accident, when a spirit known as KK enters his body, giving Akito a range of mystical abilities. You quickly realise that the fog that's appeared in Tokyo is turning the city's inhabitants into spirits, and that the only reason that this hasn't happened to Akito is because the spirit possessing him has given him a degree of immunity to the mist. So while the mist can harm him, it won't instantly transform him into a spirit like it did everyone else. And because of this, Akito is forced to form an uneasy alliance with KK. While Ghostwire Tokyo has an English dub, it defaults to Japanese audio with English subtitles, and even though I usually choose to play games dubbed, I stuck with the subtitles here, because it seems like that's how Tango intended for the game to be played. Plus, with the game taking place in Tokyo, it only feels natural for the cast to be speaking Japanese. While the Evil Within games are very tense and often very stressful survival horror games, Ghostwire Tokyo is an action horror hybrid, and because of that, it's a lot less scary than the Evil Within, mainly because you feel a lot more empowered than you would in a pure horror game. There was never a point in Ghostwire where I felt like I wasn't equipped to handle the situation I was placed in. That's not to say that Ghostwire isn't unsettling at times, but it is more creepy and atmospheric than outright scary. So even if you're not the biggest horror buff, you'll probably be able to handle Ghostwire Tokyo just fine. KK possessing Akito allows him to cast a variety of spells, which are known in the game as ethereal weaving techniques. And strangely, because of this, Ghostwire plays more like a first-person shooter than anything else. Combat revolves around weakening enemies with your weaving techniques until their core is exposed, at which point you can rip it out of them to finish them off. Combat looks and feels fantastic. You have 3 weaving techniques at your disposal, and while a couple more spells would have added some much appreciated variety, these 3 spells are still more than sufficient for taking down the spirits that stand in your way. Your 3 spell types are Wind Weaving, Water Weaving, and Fire Weaving. Wind Weaving fires quick bursts of energy that shoot straight ahead. You have more SP for Wind Weaving than any other technique, so it'll likely be the attack that you rely most heavily on. Water Weaving allows you to fling a blade of water that only travels a short distance, but has a very wide range, so it's great for knocking back multiple enemies when you're surrounded. And finally, there's Akito's strongest technique, Fire Weaving. This spell projects a forceful and fiery blast that deals a huge amount of damage, making it essential for taking down Ghostwire's stronger spirits. As you fight, you'll fill up a bar that when full allows you to use Akito's ultimate technique, Wire In. Activating this will project a wave of energy that weakens every enemy it touches, making it easier to expose their cores. Each spell has a limited amount of SP, and once you run out of SP, you can't cast that spell anymore. Thankfully, you'll find an endless assortment of corrupted objects floating around the environment that when smashed will release ether, the source of energy that refills your SP. As you start exploring Tokyo, you'll come across Jizo statues that when found will permanently increase the SP for one of your ethereal weaving techniques. Akito's combat abilities are rounded out with a melee attack that can knock back enemies and a block that decreases incoming damage. Using these abilities in conjunction with your ethereal weaving techniques is the key to surviving battles against strong spirits. Once you've gotten into the rhythm of using Akito and KK's abilities in unison, combat has a satisfying flow to it that feels unlike any other game I've ever played. Casting spells in Ghostwire feels amazing, and that's in no small part thanks to Ghostwire's fantastic utilisation of the DualSense's adaptive triggers. When you're charging up a spell, you can feel the triggers start to pulsate, and this tactile sensation adds another layer of immersion to Ghostwire Tokyo. While the adaptive triggers are used masterfully in Ghostwire Tokyo, there's some other uses of the DualSense that feel gimmicky, namely the way that Ghostwire has you draw seals on the touchpad when you purge certain spirits. While this never annoyed me, it did stand out as feeling completely unnecessary. While doing this, I was definitely having flashbacks to turning my DualShock 4 sideways and holding it like a spray paint can while playing infamous Second Son. There are times where the smartest approach to an encounter isn't to charge headfirst into a group of spirits, but instead to pick a few of them off first with your stealthy quick purge ability that lets you kill a normal enemy in one hit from behind. While this is a fun mechanic when you're doing it of your own volition, it also contributes to one of the worst aspects of Ghostwire: its stealth sections. There are sections in the story where Akito gets separated from KK, and therefore loses his ability to use ethereal weaving techniques, forcing him to sneak around and pick enemies off silently. These segments bring Ghostwire's pace to a grinding halt. Ghostwire's stealth mechanics are extremely simplistic, and aren't doing anything we haven't seen a million times before. In an attempt to make these segments a little more interesting, Akito is given a bow which is pretty powerful, and can kill a lot of normal spirits with one well-placed headshot. Well, that is if the enemy has a head, because that's not always a guarantee with the spirits in Ghostwire. While the bow feels satisfying to use, and also utilises the adaptive triggers well, it's still nowhere near as fun to use as the ethereal weaving techniques. You're also only given a very limited amount of arrows, so most stealth sections consisted of me picking off a handful of enemies with headshots, then sprinting past the remaining enemies once I was out of arrows. While the stealth areas aren't bad per se, they are dull, which makes them the glaring low point of Ghostwire Tokyo. Using the various ethereal weaving techniques is the most enjoyable aspect of Ghostwire Tokyo, so stripping you of them in exchange for underdeveloped stealth mechanics is a bad idea. You can find and purchase various talismans that have different effects when thrown to give yourself a leg up in both combat and stealth scenarios. There's the Thicket talisman that creates a bush to hide in, the Decoy talisman that'll make a noise to draw spirits away from you, the Stun talisman that paralyzes spirits with a current of electricity, and the Exposure talisman that will instantly expose the core of weak enemies and make it easier to expose the cores of strong enemies. Talismans can be an extremely powerful tool when used correctly, and a combination of stun and exposure talismans can make light work of even the most dangerous spirits in Ghostwire Tokyo. One of the strongest aspects of Ghostwire Tokyo is its large lineup of enemy spirits, which are also known as visitors. Some of the visitors are drawn directly from Japanese mythology and folk tales, and these enemies have some of the most creative and striking designs I've seen in a game recently. There's faceless spirits in suits that give off major Slender Man vibes, creepy children in raincoats who'll summon reinforcements before running away if they spot you, headless spirits in schoolgirl uniforms, and spirits that take the form of a giant woman with a hat and mask that'll slice you to shreds with a giant pair of shears. This particular spirit is no doubt based on that famous folktale about the mask-wearing woman who asks people if she's pretty, then removes her mask to reveal that her mouth has been sliced into a Chelsea grin, before asking once again if she's pretty, creating a lose-lose situation where she kills the people who say no and disfigures the people who say yes because she thinks they're lying to her. Man, that story freaked me out when I first heard it as a kid. A touch that I love is that after you've encountered an enemy for the first time, you'll be able to read a journal entry about them that provides a lot of interesting lore, with each of the spirits you encounter in Ghostwire Tokyo being brought into existence for a specific reason. For For example, you learn that the faceless spirits in suits are called rainwalkers, and they're the spirits of people who were overworked and exhausted, while wanderers, an enemy type that look almost like a cartoon ghost in a sheet, are created from the spirits of people who had a strong desire to run away. And the headless schoolgirls are called students of misery, and are a physical manifestation of the anxieties of young women. While there's a respectable amount of enemy variety in Ghostwire Tokyo, the game could do a better job of mixing up the groupings of enemies. So many battles see you fighting a group of 4 or 5 of the same enemy, usually rainwalkers or students of misery, so at a certain point you just feel like you're on autopilot in these fights. The fights where they mix it up and throw a few different types of enemies at you at once are way more interesting, and actually force you to think about what you're doing. I definitely could have gone for a few more of the stronger spirits scattered throughout the groups of enemies roaming the open world to really keep me on my toes. Initially, I was disappointed by the boss fights in Ghostwire Tokyo, finding that they were falling into the same traps that I brought up in my Wonderlands review, with bosses feeling less like a big set piece moment, and more like I was just fighting boring damage sponges with blatantly telegraphed attack patterns. But as Ghostwire goes on, the boss fights continue to improve, and by the end, the bosses start to provide genuinely exciting fights against intricately designed enemies. Unfortunately, as the best boss fights Ghostwire has to offer come in the back half of the game, I can't say much about them, as I wouldn't want to spoil anything. But I will say that the most memorable boss fight for me saw me fighting a grotesque spider monster that will be sure to haunt the nightmares of arachnophobes. Combat abilities aren't the only powers that are granted to Akito through KK's possession of his body. He's also given access to abilities that help with exploration and investigation, like the spectral vision that works a lot like Batman's detective vision in the Arkham games, allowing Akito to search for clues hidden within the environment and follow trails of spirits that have passed through an area, as well as read the minds of animals. Akito also has a variety of traversal abilities that let him navigate Tokyo's skylines with ease. He can grapple to the Tengu that sit perched atop rooftops, and glide through the air to get from building to building. These abilities feel great to use, and traversal only continues to get better as you start filling in the skill tree. As Akito levels up, his HP increases, and you're given skill points to unlock new abilities and improve the ones you already have. These upgrades include speeding up the extraction of enemy cores, letting you remove enemies' cores with a melee attack, increasing the range of Akito's spectral vision, and extending the duration of his glide. You can even unlock the ability to summon Tengu, which allows you to grapple to basically any rooftop in the game. Ghostwire allows you to lightly customize Akito's appearance by changing his clothing. While there's some fun costumes, including outfits from other Bethesda games, I can't help but feel like this kind of character customization feels redundant in a first-person game. You're only seeing Akito in cutscenes and reflections, so the inclusion almost feels like a waste of resources. I've always felt the same way about the character customization in the Far Cry series. Ghostwire Tokyo is structured much more like a traditional open world game than I ever would have expected, with Akito having free reign of a map of Tokyo that's packed with side missions to complete, collectibles to find, and a huge assortment of other boxes to tick off. While I say it's traditional, I don't mean that as an insult by any means. I love this type of game, and slowly clearing out the objectives in each area of a map really scratches the completionist itch in me. And thankfully, there was an interesting enough lineup of side activities in Ghostwire to keep me fully engrossed for the entire 45 hours it took me to get the platinum. As you explore Tokyo, you'll encounter torii gates that you can cleanse to remove the killer fog from portions of the map, granting you access to new areas and revealing new activities to complete. Think of the torii gates as the equivalent of the watchtowers often found in Ubisoft's open world games. There's some truly peculiar and fascinating side missions in Ghostwire Tokyo that task you with doing everything from observing the moon from different locations to dealing with a bloodthirsty cherry blossom tree. These side missions often showcase Ghostwire's weird side that I love so much, but the majority of side activities require you to purge a location of the yokai that's haunting it, and by doing so, you'll earn a magatama that can be used to unlock new branches on Akito's skill tree. Yokai are the often mischievous spirits that many Japanese folktales centre around. If you've played a lot of Japanese games or watched a lot of anime, you've no doubt encountered the concept of yokai before, and probably seen different interpretations of some of the yokai you'll encounter in Ghostwire Tokyo. Different yokai have completely different appearances and behaviours. While some are malevolent and require exorcism, others are more than happy to just hand over their magatama in exchange for your help. The different yokai are one of my favourite parts of Ghostwire. They have such surreal and unique designs that are unlike anything you'd come across in Western media. Many of the yokai are also very goofy, which brings some comedic levity to Ghostwire. There's the frog-like kappa yokai who swim around ponds, and to purge this water-dwelling yokai, you'll have to place a cucumber on a pedestal to lure it out, and then sneak up on it whilst it's eating. Then there's the paper-like Itan Momen, who you have to chase around while they float carelessly through the air before absorbing them once they bump into something and daze themselves. Or my personal favourites, the Roku Rokubi, yokai with long snaking necks that you'll have to follow back to their source, and the Karakasa Kozo, umbrella-like creatures with one eye and a giant tongue who hop around on one foot. Ghostwire is just an all-around great showcase of how outlandish and fascinating Japanese folklore is. There's also hidden tanuki to find who have taken the form of inanimate objects in the world, so be sure to keep an eye out for random vending machines and billboards with a bushy tail sticking out of them. You can also visit shrines, which often contain some kind of equipable item or collectible, or a fortune box that'll let you draw a fortune for a temporary buff. Some of them even have an offering box that you can make a wish at by donating money. You can wish for your health or SP to be refilled, or you can even wish for the location of a Jizo statue that you haven't found yet. If you want to 100% and platinum Ghostwire Tokyo like I did, you can expect to spend a lot of time chasing down its collectibles, because saying Tango went a little bit overboard with the collectibles would be the understatement of the century. The main collectible being the floating groups of spirits that are littered across the entire map. You absorb these spirits and then deposit them at one of Tokyo's many phone boxes in exchange for XP and money. There is a whopping 240,000 spirits to collect in Ghostwire Tokyo, and yes, you need to collect and deposit every last one of them to get the platinum. Thankfully, your efforts will be rewarded, and while I won't spoil what it is, the reward you get for completing Ghostwire after acquiring every spirit is very useful. A slight nitpick I have with Ghostwire is the icons on its map. Instead of the icon being erased or greyed out once you've cleared a side activity, its icon will instead change to a desaturated version of the colour that the icon already was, which means that it can be hard to tell at a glance whether you've completed the activity or not. Thankfully, you can set filters on the map, and one of them allows you to remove all the icons for completed activities. I have one other nitpick with Ghostwire that I need to rant about, though this nitpick also applies to many other games. And while this isn't something that will be a problem for everyone, it annoys the hell out of me, and I know that I'm not the only one. Developers, please stop putting RNG based trophies in your game. Trophies based around luck are so frustrating, especially when they're the last thing standing between you and a platinum, which is the exact predicament I found myself in with Ghostwire. There's a trophy in Ghostwire for drawing the worst possible fortune from a shrine's fortune box. Unfortunately, you only have about a 1% chance of drawing this fortune, which meant I had to spend over an hour drawing fortunes and reloading my save every time I got the wrong one, which was about as fun as it sounds. Across Tokyo, you'll cross paths with countless Shiba Inus and cats that have been left wandering the streets since their owners vanished, and if you're like me, you're probably going to waste a lot of time petting every animal you come across. While the models for Ghostwire's cats and dogs are a little off, I was blown away by how well animated they are. The animals are so expressive, with the animators perfectly capturing the mannerisms of cats and dogs. Their yawns, the way they groom themselves, and how they lean in when you pat them feels so spot on. And the Shiba Inus aren't only here to make the world feel a bit more alive, they can also help you out. You can give the Shiba Inus treats, and in return they'll often dig up some cash for you, and occasionally they'll even lead you to a new Jizo statue. Ghostwire Tokyo's environment design is spectacular. As spirits tend to dwell in locations with a negative energy to them, Ghostwire sees you visiting some very creepy and very tragic locations. You'll be exploring everything from hospitals, to hoarder houses, to tall buildings where suicides have occurred. As I said earlier, while Ghostwire isn't outright scary, it is atmospheric, and its environments do a lot of heavy lifting in creating its haunting atmosphere. There's something inherently unnerving about hospitals. No one wants to be in one at the best of times, so there's a reason they're such a common setting in horror, and Ghostwire does a great job of tapping into these baked-in fears we have. There's also something deeply unsettling about seeing the clothes of all the citizens who vanished being left strewn across the streets of Tokyo. The remarkable environment design is best showcased in a handful of jaw-dropping set pieces that crop up throughout Ghostwire, where the game places you in environments that are being tampered with by spirits. You'll find yourself walking through a perfectly normal looking apartment or street, when out of nowhere your perspective shifts and you're suddenly walking along the walls of the building, or you might find yourself walking atop the Tokyo skyline on floating umbrellas, or see the painted lines on the road start lifting up and wiggling in midair. These surreal and trippy moments show just how creative Tango can get, and they're probably some of the most memorable gaming sequences I've come across so far in 2022. While Ghostwire features some subpar textures in places, the game as a whole is remarkably pretty. The lighting and rain effects are stunning, and the drenched streets of Tokyo look absolutely breathtaking, with the puddles lining the streets reflecting their surroundings beautifully. I played through Ghostwire Tokyo in performance mode, and the game still looked incredible, while almost always maintaining a solid frame rate of 60 FPS, with the only exception being a couple of underworld areas where the game's frame rate would briefly take a noticeable hit. Unfortunately, while the gameplay and world of Ghostwire Tokyo had me hooked the whole way through, the same can't be said about the story. Ultimately, Ghostwire's story doesn't capitalise on its amazing premise as well as it should have. The concept of the population of a major city like Tokyo just vanishing in an instant is fascinating and scary, but instead of telling the creepy story filled with mystery and intrigue that I expected, Ghostwire gave me a completely forgettable story jam-packed with ridiculous anime-style melodrama. That's not to say the story isn't without its bright points, with Ghostwire's villain Hanya, who wants to create a world where the realms of the living and dead are combined into one, being the clear highlight of the story for me. Hanya is a genuinely imposing villain, and his appearance, featuring a damaged Hanya mask with black liquid dripping from the eye holes, is genuinely one of the coolest character designs I've seen in a long time. But these glimmers of greatness just make the overall dull story all the more disappointing. While its story didn't leave any lasting impression on me, Ghostwire Tokyo is still one of the most unique games you can play right now, and that alone merits taking a look at it. In an industry that's increasingly focused on sequels and franchises, it's so refreshing to get a brand new AAA IP, especially when it's a game that goes against the grain and does something entirely new like Ghostwire has. Tango deserve a lot of credit for their originality, and Bethesda should be commended for funding a game that's so out there. I didn't know what to expect going into Ghostwire Tokyo, but it turned out to be one of 2022's greatest surprises. Ghostwire Tokyo's smooth traversal, satisfying spell-flinging combat, unsettling atmosphere, and deep exploration of Japanese folklore make it one of my favourite games of 2022 thus far. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can also find countless other reviews on my channel, including my reviews of Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and Elden Ring. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Eiyuden Chronicles Rising, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge.